ETS2, or the second European carbon trading scheme, is a prime example of what is wrong with the EU today. Okay, to explain this and to understand what I mean by this, we have to back up a bit and understand what is European carbon trading to begin with. All right. Okay, so in 2005, the EU instituted the first carbon trading scheme, which means that factories, producers, companies, they get a right to produce pollution and they get to trade that right to pollute. This is what it's basically about, the right to pollute. It has been legalized in a system called carbon trading. And if you have a factory, for instance, you can pollute to a certain amount. You get a certain right to pollute. And if you go over that legal limit to pollute, then you have to buy more pollution credits. You have to buy more carbon emission credits. And if you are under that level, then you end up with more pollution credits, basically, then you can pollute. Then you have the right to pollute, and you can sell those credits on an open market. This is essentially what carbon trading is. The European carbon trading scheme is. It's an open market for the legalized right to create pollution. That's what it is. Okay, so this was in 2005, but it was only for like heavy industry and stuff like that. Now, the European Commission thought that this was such a fantastic system that now they've decided to roll it out to households as well. Yeah, that's right. You and I and everybody else, just ordinary householders, ordinary citizens will now also have to start paying carbon emission tax. And again, they say this is not a tax because it's apparently a price. It's a price it's a right which can be sold on the open market. But in practice, it's actually a extra tax. It's a tax on heating, and it's a tax on driving, and it's a tax on electricity. So it's a tax on cooking. It's basically a tax on living. It is a tax on daily life that you as a consumer will have to pay. Because what are they actually doing here? This tax, this European trading scheme, carbon trading scheme number 2, which they're going to roll out from 2026 to 2027, by the way, is an extra tax on emissions created by specific fuels, fossil fuels specifically. So we're talking about oil, we're talking about gas, we're talking about coals, we're talking about all that sort of stuff. If you as a consumer heat your house, for instance, with electricity which is produced by for instance, your national electricity producer, and that electricity plant uses coal or gas or oil, then that electricity producer will have to pay pollution rights for every ounce of electricity he produces and sells to you. Now, and here comes the really nasty bit, because they say this is not specifically for householders, but on the other hand, it is specifically for householders, because it is the electricity producers which will have to pay the extra costs of this electricity tax, basically, this power tax. And you better believe that they will calculate this extra price in your daily, weekly, monthly, yearly electricity usage, power bill, and so on, because there is no electricity producer in the world which is going to have to take on this extra cost, and which is just going to say, this is a bit unfair, don't you think, for the consumer? Let's just pay it out of our own pocket. No, they're not going to say that. No, they're not going to say that at all, and you know it, because that's not how the world works. They're going to calculate this into the price, and the price of power, of electricity, of fuel, of everything that you need to basically live your daily life is going to go up. It is going to go up. And see, this is the problem of the EU today. We already live in Europe, we know, is already going through an amazing energy crisis right now. An amazing and avoidable energy crisis right now, where people are actually living in energy starvation. They are living in energy poverty, because there are people in Europe who cannot afford to stay warm in winter now. They actually have to switch off central heating because they cannot stay warm in winter, because they cannot afford it. Think about this for a moment. And instead of helping these people by lowering prices, for instance, the European Commission has basically decided, and this is with the agreement of all the national governments, by the way, let's not forget this, they've decided, let's just make power even more expensive than it already is. And you know what? This is why European citizens suffer. This is also why Europe's industry is suffering right now. Because if you are a manufacturing industry, you need power, you need electricity to manufacture stuff, products. And the more energy you need, or the more power you need, the higher the price for power is going to be, the higher the price for your end product is going to be. So basically, by raising the cost of production of industry in Europe, the European Union has effectively worked to make Europe's industry less competitive with the rest of the world. Less competitive with the US, less competitive with China, less competitive with everybody else out there. Because it's just too expensive to produce in Europe. It's just too expensive. And this is why countries like China can dump their stuff on European markets. And then you hear the European Union, specifically the European Commission, and also all these national governments, spokespeople, prime minister, presidents, whatnot, whatever, all going on about, Europe really needs to be independent. We need to have European sovereignty on this and that and whatever. We need to support our industry and whatever. But at the same time, they are working hard to undermine Europe's ability to actually produce and produce competitively. And this is the nub of the matter. This is the nub of the matter. They've done it to Europe's industry. And they've only done it to Europe's industry. Only. And this is, for instance, the weird bit as well. Because, for instance, the first European carbon trading scheme, and also now the second European carbon trading scheme, airlines, international airlines, are exempt from this. They do not have to pay carbon emission rights. Now, intra-European, internal domestic flights, they're going to have to pay for this. But international flights, they don't. Even though we know that international flights are some of the most polluting industry on Earth. They are some of the biggest polluters on Earth. But yet, they are exempt. Except for when a flight flies from one European destination to another European destination. Then, they suddenly fall under the European trading scheme. Isn't that odd? Isn't that weird? And this is the problem. This is the problem. So Europe goes on this crusade, this green crusade, to reach net zero. Even though, let's be honest, net zero, it's an logical impossibility. Because whenever you produce something, you will have some sort of wastage. You will have some sort of something. You will have carbon. That's just the way the world works. If you produce something, you will have some sort of waste. As simple as that. Now, when you take that waste, then you need to take it and you need to actually process it into something so it's not harmful, so you can recycle it or something. You need to actually treat that waste and make sure it does not harm the environment. Because cleanliness and the environment is actually important, right? It's important. And we do this in Europe. On the whole, we actually do this in Europe. Europe is green. Europe is clean. And if you've ever been outside of Europe, you agree with me with this statement. You know that this statement is true. If you've ever been to China, if you've ever been to the US, if you've ever been to Africa, basically the rest of the world outside of Europe, you know how dirty it can get there, and that there really is no environmental protection. There is no recycling. Basically, when it comes to green, when it comes to clean, Europe is doing really, really, really well. When it comes to doing maintenance, when it comes to basically making sure that everything works, Europe is doing really, really well. So that is why I think it's actually really weird that Europe is on this drive for net zero, which cannot possibly be achieved. Because again, let's look at the facts. Which are the biggest polluters in the world? What countries are actually the biggest polluters in the world right now? And the answer is simple. The biggest polluters in the world are China, United States, and India. Those are the biggest, by far the biggest polluters in the world, the biggest producers of carbon in the world, carbon emissions in the world. China alone accounts for 26.2% of world carbon emissions, while the US is responsible for another 11.5%. This is the list. Number 1, China, with 26.16% share of total emissions, followed by the US, followed by with 11.53% share of total emissions, followed by India, 7.69% share of total emissions, followed by Russia, 3.75% of total emissions, Brazil, Indonesia, Japan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Canada, DRC. Germany, the first European country, is on number 12 with 1.43%. You see how this goes, right? The biggest polluters in the world right now, China and the US, followed by India. These are the biggest polluters in the world. So whatever we do in Europe when it comes to getting down to net zero and getting close to the net zero, it won't actually make much of a difference. No. As long as the Chinese aren't doing anything, and then as long as the Americans aren't doing anything about their own pollution, it actually isn't going to make a big difference what we do in Europe either way. Because we already are really low in the percentages when it comes to pollution and emissions. So this is why these percentages show you why it is so bloody weird that the EU keeps on hammering, keeps on going on, driving forward with that race towards net zero, especially seeing the gigantic economic damage that this is doing. And it is doing economic damage, and it will do even more, greater economic damage, because now it's going to do economic damage to you personally. Not just like German industry, which is crumbling, or European industry, actually, which is doing really badly, but you personally. And it's going to cost you. And how much is it going to cost you? Well, people have calculated this. Because here, this is from ABN AMRO, big Dutch bank, right? How will EU ETS2 nudge household energy bills? So what they say, the European Union Emission Trading System, EU ETS, is the flagship climate policy in the EU. It has been around since 2005, like I said, and mainly covers emissions from electricity generation, heavy industry, aviation, and most recently international shipping. Except aviation, it's only like intra-European, not any long distance international flights, which are still exempt. The remaining combustion emissions from the road transport, buildings, and other light industry sections will be addressed in a separate system called EU ETS2, or the second European emission trading scheme. EU ETS2 will be phased in gradually with a monitoring and reporting phase starting in 2025. And the system shall be fully operational in 2026. Fuel suppliers, rather than consumers, will be responsible to report their emissions and surrender allowances. So again, like I said, fuel suppliers will be directly taxed for the fuel they supply. And that will logically, because this is how the world works, logically result in increased prices for the consumer. And we shall see this. The new system envisions lower emission reduction targets of 43% by 2030 from 2005 levels compared to 62% under EU ETS1. The system will cover main fuels like natural gas, gasoline, diesel, heating oil, liquefied petroleum gas, LPG, and coal, which sometimes is used in some industrial settings. Okay, so basically this is what it says. This is what it's about. And then they go on. Launching in 2027, EU ETS2 2 targets emissions from transport, buildings and light industry, aiming for a 43% reduction by 2030 from 2005 levels. It includes a market stability reserve to prevent excessive price hikes, with a cap set for initial years at 59 euros per ton CO2 in 2027 prices. Although I have to also be skeptical about this, because we've seen as well, like for instance with the Corona rescue funds, that this money, it got spent and then suddenly it wasn't there anymore. So the EU keeps saying that they will control prices. The EU will also says that they will do a special social fund for people who can't afford to, for instance, switch over to a different kind of heating system or whatever, or to renovate their houses. But we have to see in practice how this is going to work out, and if it's going to work out the same way all the other funds have worked out so far, it's going to be empty before soon, and then there's not going to be anything. So basically you're going to be on your own. This is honestly what I expect based on previous observations of observable reality. Because this is also the weird thing, right? This is the weird thing, because the EU and all the national governments which have signed on to this thing, they say that this is to motivate people to move away from heating their houses with fossil fuels, and to move away to more renewable fuel sources, and to move away from driving cars, and to move towards, for instance, taking public transportation and stuff like that. Now in practice we know, for instance, that taking public transportation isn't always practical. I mean, personally, I love public transportation. I'm really proud of the fact that Europe has a wide-reaching network of public transportation. This is something you do not have everywhere in the world, believe me. So we can be proud of this. But at the same time, I also know that public transportation is very often simply not practical. It simply isn't. You can't, for instance, do grocery shopping for the entire month with the bus or the tram or whatever. This is not going to work. Sometimes you need to be able to drive a car. And then it's really fucked up, to be honest. Let's be honest. I'm sorry for saying it like that, but let's be honest. It's really fucked up. It's really screwed up that you have to pay extra taxes just because you need to get around, because you need to be mobile. But it gets more bizarre than that, of course, because the EU says that this extra taxation, which isn't a taxation in their words, but actually really is though, this extra taxation is to motivate people away from warming their houses with fossil fuels, like oil, coal, whatever, and to step over to renewable fuel sources. Fantastic, great idea, because honestly, like renewable fuel, renewable energy sources, who doesn't like them, right? Okay, the only problem there with that logic, however, is that if you are heating your house, then most likely you do not actually have a choice, much of a choice, in where your energy comes from, because you're hooked up to the grid. You've got a contract with the energy producer, and they will produce the energy from whatever fuel they basically produce it from. As a consumer, you don't honestly have a lot of say, a lot of choice, because in most countries in Europe, let's be honest about this, the majority of energy is not from renewable sources, because honestly, Europe, the climate of Europe, for instance, it's not ideal for renewable sources. Europe is simply not ideal for solar energy, wind energy, because where you can plant all your windmills, because Europe is like really crowded and densely built, so you need space for that. Where are you going to put it? All these questions. So we have to honestly be honest about this. Most energy in Europe is still produced from fossil fuels, and as a consumer you don't really have a choice about that, not really. That makes it really screwed up of the European Commission to then say, well, we're going to raise this tax, we're going to put this tax on top of your fuel bill to motivate you to switch over to renewable fuel, renewable energy source. Because how do they expect that you're going to do this in practice? And this is the problem again. The European Union, especially the European Commission, they live in an ivory tower, and they don't really seem to know how daily life really is for the daily European. citizen. But anyway, this European trading scheme, number 2, will result in higher prices. How much exactly? Well, they have calculated this, of course. The clever people, or ABN AMRO did some calculations as well. And what is the answer to this? Average household energy bills could rise by 319 to 489 euros per year. So let's say you're going to pay an extra 500 euros a year. And I'm rounding it up, by the way, because they also said that every year there'll be fewer emission rights that will be issued. So the price will go up, will be driven up every year, because the rights to pollute, the rights to create emissions, to emit emissions, they will go down, because we need to go to net zero, right? Even though reaching net zero is really, really physically impossible, we still need to go to net zero. So every year there'll be fewer emission rights to trade on the open emission right trading market, which means that every year the price will go up. So yeah, you'll start paying probably 300 to 500 euros extra a month, depending on whether you drive a car, depending on your central heating, depending on everything basically, depending on whether you cook with gas or with electricity or something like that, depending on where the electricity comes from and how your electricity plant, your electricity producer produces that electricity, which is something that you have no say or no control over whatsoever. All of these factors together, all of these fluctuating factors together, mean that your price will probably end up between 300 and 500 euros extra per person per year. That's already quite a chunk, to be honest, seeing that right now in Europe, there are people who cannot afford to pay for heating, electricity, because they simply can't afford it anymore. But there will be, so an extra 500 euros a year on top of your heating bill, on top of your fuel bill. And those prices will only go up, and they will go up, and they will go up, and they will go up. And well, why are they going up? Because this is not a regular tax where the government decides this is going to be the tax for this year or this month or whatever. No, these are trading rights which are traded on a market. So the price fluctuates. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. As a consumer, you have no control over this whatsoever. So, for instance, if the carbon emission trade, the price goes up for whatever reason, because there's, let's say, another war somewhere in the Middle East or something, who knows, who knows, or a trade dispute with the US or whatever, then, hey, maybe you're going to pay an extra 1,000 euros because the price has just gone up. And you have no control over that whatsoever. Now, my question is this fair? Is this fair? Is this a good idea? No, of course not. No, of course not. Because I can already tell you, and they also say, right there, they say, financial support via social climate fund will aim to cushion the impact on low-income households by funding sustainable energy transitions. Even though we know that in many cases those sustainable energy transitions are simply not available, especially not for low-income households, because what they're talking about is that you have to renovate your home, you have to isolate everything, you have to do solar panels and so on. And that is simply not available to many people who have a low income or even a moderate income. It's simply not available. This costs a lot of money, and I can predict that social climate fund that's gonna be created for this point, it will be empty before you know it. It will simply not get enough money to help everybody who's being hurt by this new energy tax. It's simply not going to happen. It's not going to be enough, because all of Europe, every European citizen will have to pay this extra carbon tax. Now, does this make sense to you? Does this sound like a good idea to you? Does this sound fair to you? No, this does not sound fair. This does not sound like a good idea, because this is just taking a problem which Europe right now has. Europe is in a energy crisis right now, a debilitating energy crisis. And instead of alleviating the energy price, and lowering the energy price, this new tax is actually going to raise energy prices even more. It's going to make energy even more unaffordable for Europeans, and also European citizens, European companies, European industry, European households. It's going to make it even more unaffordable. Going to make Europe even more expensive to live in, to survive in. And this is simply not right. It is simply not right. And this is the very nub of the problem. This is a symbol, a potent example of what is wrong with the EU today. That the people who run the EU aren't doing it for European citizens. They're not. They're doing it for their ideology. They're doing it for their personal ideology. They're doing it because they have an agenda which has nothing to do with the well-being of the average European citizen and the average European household, and nothing to do with it. So this is the problem. This is the very heart of the problem, that people who run the EU are doing it not to help the EU, but to bring it down, to destroy it. And this is why we need to do something about this, and specifically to really, really democratize the EU. Democratize. If we want to save it, we have to make sure that European citizens actually have a say in the running of the European Union. It's the only way we can save the European project, because laws like this, with taxes like this, it will only get worse and worse and worse. And this, therefore, is a taxation that needs to be scrapped as soon as possible. ETS2 needs to be scrapped. It is as simple as that, because it's unfair to European citizens. It's unfair to struggling European households. And it's taking a horrible energy crisis and making the problem only worse. And we know who's responsible for this. We know who's responsible for making this problem worse, and we need to get rid of them. We need to get rid of them, because nothing will ever get better for Europe until we actually democratize Europe from the ground